वो तो भरत जी को कोई इंट्रोडक्शन नहीं दे सकता, संभव नहीं। हमारे देश में वरिष्ठतम विद्वान है सब चीज में। सितार और सुबह में बजाते हैं, बस बिल्कुल साक्षात मैहर घराने में उनकी तालीम, बहुत बड़े उस्तादों से उनकी तालीम, प्रोफेशनल लेवल प्लेइंग। और असल में उनकी प्रोफेशन क्या है? अंग्रेजी पढ़ाना। अंग्रेजी कहाँ नाट्य शास्त्र और कहाँ अंग्रेजी पढ़ाना? चलो वो भी ठीक है, अंग्रेजी इन्होंने 3-4 डेकेड तक पढ़ाया दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी में एज ए प्रोफेसर, वो भी ठीक है, चलिए अंग्रेजी पढ़ा। अरे वो तो बिल्कुल महाविद्वान है ग्रीक थिएटर एंड ग्रीक टेस्ट, वो बिल्कुल अपने काबिल शिष्य हैं आचार्य बृहस्पति जी। मैंने भी कुछ चीजें सीखी थी उनसे। अद्भुत थी, ये कैसे होता है, सब चीज कैसे कर सकता है, इट्स अमेजिंग। इसको कहते हैं गुरु कृपा। इन पर गुरु कृपा है और मेहनत है। अभी भी रोजाना कम से कम 8 से 9 घंटा काम करते हैं और एक न एक प्रेजेंटेशन देते हैं। अभी भरत जी को कोई इंट्रोडक्शन की जरूरत नहीं है। सिर्फ यही बोलूंगी, आज हमारे देश में वरिष्ठतम विद्वान श्री भरत गुप्त जी है। भरत गुप्त जी जो भी बोलेंगे हमारे लिए बिल्कुल वेद वाक्य होगा, अद्भुत होगा।
प्रणाम, सबको प्रणाम। आपका आशीर्वचन ही मान रहा हूँ जो आपने मेरे लिए कहा। आप मेरी बड़ी बहन के समान हैं। आपके आशीर्वचन के आदेश के अनुसार ही मैं कुछ कहने का प्रयास करता हूँ। So I'll switch on to English now. I'll just begin by a small Ganga Taranga Ramaniya Jata Kalapam Gauri Nirantar Vibhushita Vama Bhagam Narayana Priyamananga Madapaharam Varanasi Purpatim Bhaja Vishwanath। तो विश्वनाथ ही अधिष्ठात्र देवता हैं नाट्य शास्त्र के। So we think of Shiva as the deity who presides over Natya Shastra along with Brahma. Now what am I going to say in these 40 minutes is just a few important things about Natya Shastra. We have a large number of scholars of Natya Shastra here and Vidwans of various subjects of Indology. So I need not repeat the usual things about it, but as the title is Natya Shastra Past and Present. You see, what was the Natya Shastra in past and how can we use it today? Because all my life I have tried to figure out how I can make use of Natya Shastra today. How can it be put to practice today? And how can we benefit from it in a very practical manner in terms of art, not just in terms of theory. So I make about 12 points about Natya Shastra today. You see, first of all about the date. People have constantly written, great people like Kapilaji, who was my mentor in many ways, V. Raghavan, and various other scholars have repeatedly written that Natya Shastra belongs to 2nd century BC to 2nd century AD. But nobody has ever given a reason for their dating. Nobody has mentioned why, how, etc. They have all talked about its proximity to the Vedas, but they still place it 2nd century BC, 2nd century AD. So there is no logic to it. The real reason is very simple. Because this whole business of dating in terms of Christian chronology had to be done by Western Indologists. These Indologists came with a prejudice that theatre was invented in Greece in 6th century BC. And so theatre anywhere in the world has to be much after that. Now, of course, earlier many people wrote about it and gave their all kinds of arguments, but that does not stand the test of any time or any investigation at all. So if you go to what is the real text saying, as I shall talk about in a few ways, and the Vedic text, then you will see that it is so far related to the Vedic text, and therefore it cannot be some text belonging to 2nd century BC only. It has to be much older. Now the other important point that I want to mention here is this. See, the Indian text cannot be dated like the Greek text or the European text. They don't belong to a specific person, they don't belong to a specific age. They belong to a parampara. They belong to a tradition. So our tradition makes it very clear that there was a Vriddha Bharat who wrote before Bharat, elder Bharat, and then there was a later Bharat. So Bharat is a line of persons who have mentioned certain rules, regulations, observations about the art of theatre. And it is the life of that art of theatre which has been recorded by a series of texts. And the present text which has come down to us is something which is around 5th century BC. I have mentioned the reasons for it in my book Dramatic Concepts Greek and Indian, which Makarand, if he is around, would remember reviewing it back sometime in 1995. And I have shown that it is a text which precedes Ramayana and Mahabharata, older than Valmiki Ramayana. And I have given all the reasons and I have given all the documentation in that small thing very clearly, that all the musicological terms and all the terms used by Valmiki and Mahabharata are technical terms, and these technical terms have to come from a musicological or a dramaturgical text. It cannot be the other way around. A dramaturgical text cannot borrow from a literary work like a kavya like Ramayana or an itihas. And Natyashastra, or actually Natya Ved, is the beginning of kavya and itihas. Now, having said that much, and that much only I have time to mention today, I'll go on to this whole idea of treating Natyashastra as Pancham Ved. Now, quite a few of our people, especially our dear Marxist friends and secularists, they take an anti-Brahminical attitude and they say, well, this Pancham Ved system, this Pancham Ved mention is just some kind of a nonsense which has been foisted on to Natyashastra in order to elevate it. But if you look closely at the very first chapter, Utpatti Adhyaya, the Utpatti Adhyaya makes it very clear that there is a development of dramaturgical techniques mentioned in the whole story. The whole story mentions which techniques come first, which is added later, then the third and the fourth, and there is a sequence to it, and that this is a sophisticated art which did not come out of nowhere, but which borrowed techniques from existing performing traditions. And all these performing traditions belong to the Vedic practice. The practice of Yajna, the practice of Dhruvagans, the practice of Nritya. of them are there, and I shall very briefly talk about them to give you the real sequence. Now, all of us know, and we stop there, we don't go further, that it says Jagraha Pathyam Rigveda, that the Pathya or the text was taken from Rigveda. Now, this is not just an idle mention, because preservation of the text was a miracle performed by the Rigvedi Brahmins. They preserved the text in 8 different pathas, Ashta Vikriti. There was such a great technique to preserve the text, and there was such a great emphasis upon what is going to be the text and how the text should not change. So that whole technology of knowing the text, of preserving the text and using the text for a performance comes from the whole Vedic milieu. Just as the mantra Agnimide Purohitam is put into Samgan. You see, only the 3 notes Agnimide Purohitam is put into the 7 notes in Samgan. It is put into a ritual practice in Yajurveda, and it is used along with other philosophical systems and science of medicine to provide rasa. Here rasa means aushadhi in the context of Atharva Veda, which is the elixir, which is the life-giving force, and which is the elixir of dramaturgical performance. So this is the use of the 4 Vedas, but that is not all. Natyashastra story makes it very clear that when Brahma said to Bharat Muni, okay, perform, and he performed, his performance was incomplete because there was no softness in it. There was nothing enticing about it, for the very simple reason that women were missing from it. So Brahma himself said that bring in the Kaishiki Vritti, and Bharat Muni says, okay, then give me Apsaras, give me female actors. This is indicating the fact that very early in Indian theatre, at the earliest juncture, women were brought in to perform because it was thought that there can be no softer feeling, there can be no romantic feeling, there can be no eroticism, there can be no Kaishiki Vritti without the Apsaras. Well, of course, Apsaras means women, the female characters. And that is another record of how Indian theatre at the very earliest instance included women as performers. Now this is the most important thing which you have to understand from the dramaturgical point of view. After that, along with that, there was still something which was missing. And what was it? The missing thing was the musical instruments. Because music had been brought in already with the Samved, but that music was not the music of Veda, but that was Gandharva. It was something entirely different. You see, we always commit the mistake of considering the Vedic notes as the notes of initial Indian classical music or Gandharva. Now that is something very different. The Vedic notes are not musically in consonance. So the music which was brought in with Natyashastra was called Gandharva. And this Gandharva was the sophisticated music in which the musical scales, etc., they all came in. And they could not be sung to perfection by men alone. There had to be female singers in it. But where is the Veda in it? The question, where are the Vedic techniques in it? Because the Vedic techniques did not include women singing. The Vedic technique consisted of what is called the Dhruvagan. Now, what was this Dhruvagan? There were 14 kinds of songs which was sung when there was a break in the Vedic Yajna. In between the performances, many Dhruva songs were sung, particularly in praise of Shiva and his exploits or his beauty or his family, and these songs were considered as an essential part of the yaga. And they were sacred and they were essential part of the Vedic yajna and performance. You see, the Vedic yajna was not just the yajna for the sake of a particular yajman who was to achieve something. It was a great social event. And if it was, as and when it was a social event, there was huge participation by various sections of society. There were musical instruments which were played to the accompaniment of these Dhruva songs. So these Dhruva songs, being essential, were to be incorporated into Natya. And they could not be incorporated unless something more fundamental called Nritya was brought in. Now, Brahma and Bharat Muni, they create Natyashastra to begin with by taking different aspects of performance like Pathya, Sangeeta, Abhinaya, Rasa. Then they have to add Nritya, which they go to seek from Shiva. And it is here Shiva who provides them the education of Nritya. Now remember, Nritya is something which is not created by Shiva. Shiva only remembers it. Maya api idam smritam nrityam. This Nritya is remembered by me. You always remember something which has existed. What you create is fresh, but you remember something old. So Shiva also remembers something which is there with creation, which is a pulsation, which is a art, which is a dynamic, which Shiva remembers and which he danced and taught to Tandu. Now here, Bharat Muni is taught Nritya. This Nritya is different from Abhinay. Because Abhinay is a set of gestures given in a location with a purpose, with a meaning, and with a social significance. But Nritya or dance or movement of the body, which is not located into a very specific story, but which is independent by itself, which is a nikshep, which is a movement of the body, gatra, that is Nritya. And that is taught by Tandu to Bharat Muni. A lot of work has been done on Nritya. Nritya, which was taught to Bharat Muni, consisted of three fundamental things. The first thing was Angahara, and the second was Rechaka, and the third was Pindi Bandha. Now, a lot of work has been done on Angaharas, or rather on the fundamental language of Angaharas, the alphabets of Angaharas called the Karanas. And as we are all familiar with the very excellent work of Padma Subramanian, she has documented the whole thing very beautifully. But Karanas create Angaharas. The beautiful movement to look, the beautiful movement to present is an Angahara. It is not a Karana. Karana is just like Shruti helps you create a raga or embellish a raga. It is not something you can play by itself. Similarly, Karana is not something which is to be practiced by itself. And Angahara has to be practiced. Angahara is a full body movement, and as part of the leg movement is a leg rechak, pada rechak. Part of the belly movement is the madhya rechak, then the hasta rechak and the griva rechak. These are the ways in which you move your griva, your neck, your hands, your belly and your feet to make the rechakas. But finally, with this dance, something much more significant has to be done, and that is Pindi Bandha. Now that Pindi Bandha is something which has been entirely neglected so far by our dramaturgists, and what is worse, even by our dancers. Pindi Bandh is a very significant part of Natyashastra. What is this Pindi Bandh? When the Ganas of Shiv saw Shiva dancing, and when Parvati was also moved to join him in dance and perform what is called the Lasya, then the Ganas of Shiv or the disciples of Shiv noticed that in his dance, Shiva had encaptured the idea of certain devatas in his dance. It appeared as if certain devatas were part of his dance. The figures could be seen there, and they were called Pindi Bandhas. The technical term Pindi Bandha means that in your pind or in your body, you incorporate, you make a bandha of the various qualities of a given devata. Let us say the devata is Indra. Then the face of the Indra, the well-lit face of the Indra, then the ayudh or the weapon of the Indra, which is Vajra, then the Vahan of the Indra, the vehicle, which is Garuna, and then the postures he adopts in his walk and gait or in giving blessings. All these gestures, which can be called as iconic expressions, they make up the Pindi Bandha. When these qualities are put on, these characteristics are brought on to a dancer's body. So, Pindi Bandha is something which enlivens a large number of devatas who are Vedic devatas, like Saraswati, like Indra, like Shiva. Shiva is Rudra in Veda, and so forth. This were to be performed on the stage in the Purvarang as part of Nritta, and Tandu gave the education of Angaharas, he gave the education of Rechakas along with Pindi Bandha. So, Pindi Bandha is presented in consonance with the singing of Dhruvagan. And these Dhruvagans are again songs in the praise of different devatas. And they were part of the Vedic Yajna. So I'm drawing your attention to the fact that the very simple fundamental grammar, the technical grammar of Indian dance is something that grows out of the Vedic ritual. Therefore, to call this a Pancham Ved is not just in terms of the theological or the dharmic or the philosophical knowledge that it brings of the Vedas to the people. It is not just that. It draws upon a large number of practical techniques which were practiced in the Vedic ritual and in different art forms around it. And here we have a very good documentation indicating the earliest Vedic ritual in terms of the practice of the yajna and the use of 4 Vedas in it, and the dhruvagans and the musical instruments. Because you had to play the musical instruments as essential part of the Vedic ritual. So the Shattantri, Venu and various other instruments had to be played at the time when the yajna was performed. You see, if you reconstruct the whole Vedic ritual, then you will see that this yaga was a great social event, as and when it was not a private thing done in a individual's hut. Then it involved various sections of people, various sections of society, various kinds of artists, and people who had their place in that Vedic ritual. And it is from this that the Natyashastra grew, and therefore it was called the 5th Vedas. So on one side, it is the 5th Veda because it brings the knowledge of Vedas to everybody, not just those who study the Vedas or who practice, or those who are Vedadhita, or those who take the Vedas, learn them and expound upon them, because that's something you can't do unless you spend 40 years of your life. So that whole knowledge as well as that ritual and practice was transformed into Natyashastra, and hence it became the Pancham Veda. Now I very briefly mentioned this thing. I have several articles which go into the details and which expound upon how the Pindi Bandhas were performed, or how the different kinds of 14 kinds of dhruvagans were there, and how they transformed further into dramatic performance. We don't have the time to go into that today. So this is just the point about the Pancham Veda. So this very sophisticated art form includes various techniques, and finally it also, Natyashastra gives the history of the formation of the theatre house. Now, why a theatre house? Why was it not done in the open? And why was it a temporary theatre house? You see, the reason why none of the ancient theatre houses survive, in a stark contrast to the Greek amphitheatres, there is no ancient Indian theatre house that survived, because it was a temporary structure, purposely made so. Very humorously, I asked some of my senior students that they have photographs from their marriage, but has anybody preserved their marriage mandap? No, you do all kinds of things in a Hindu marriage, but you never preserve your mandap. The mandap is taken away the moment the ritual is performed. The guy comes and takes away everything. So this was essential as part of the Vedic ritual, that the whole theatre house had to be dismantled. But a theatre house had to be made because those who did not like theatre were to be kept out. So very early, they settled this question as to what is going to be the relationship between freedom of expression and disruption. That people will have the freedom of expression to make fun of just about anybody they like. If they are actors, by telling stories, they can tell stories about king and make fun of them, like the Vidushak does. They can make stories about Brahmins and make fun of the teachers and various important people, as you have in Prahasanas and various everything. But you need a theatre house so that people who get angry or who are politically disturbed they cannot enter. So this theatre house was not just for the convenience of a class, but it was also to allow freedom of expression and to prevent disruption, to allow art to propagate the ideas that it wants to. Now, this much I have said very briefly about the techniques of Natyashastra, or the techniques which were used in the ancient theatre. I'm going to say something about the 10 kinds of genres which were used. You see, most of us today who don't know the history of ancient Indian theatre, we think that all ancient plays were Abhigyan Shakuntalam, or they were all about kings and king falling in love with beautiful damsels. But that's not true. That's just part of the story. There were 10 kinds of plays. There were love stories of businessmen. There were love stories of prodigals, almost scoundrels. There was a genre called bhaan given to them. There were stories about gods and creatures of the underworld. Because in the ancient world, like the ancient Greek world, human beings were not the only people who occupied the space. The loka, or creation, consisted of the upper world of gods, the middle world of humans, and the nether world of the inhabitants of the nether world or the underworld. So there were plays about different levels of creation and about different levels of society. So there were plays about when a great mishap happened. You can write a perfect play in ancient style about Corona. Because Corona is a great tragedy which is killing millions of people. So we have an ancient genre called Anka, Utsrishtikanka, in which you talk about the ravages of war or the ravages of a destruction which visits society. And then there were prahasanas and two, three other kinds of plays. So there were 10 kinds of plays which were practiced on the stage. And now today, in order to make theatre relevant and useful, you can revive quite a few of them. One of my students, Rashma Kalsi, has written a new play in a Prahasan style. The play is called Padma Shri Prahasan. She is making fun of people who run after Padma Shri and don't look to art or who don't look to learning. They spend a lot of time just in social pushing and doing all kinds of social relationships, which is against the very spirit of art. So it's a spoof on such people in the imitation of the ancient plays, and a modern play is delivered out of an ancient genre. Similarly, some of the older genres like bhaan are very good templates for a modern play. You see, if you take the spirit of the characters, the relationship of the characters, the lokal, and bring in modern characters, replace the ancient ones with the modern, you have something very relevant, and which again serves the purpose of the ancient rupakas. So Natyashastra can be of very, very practical utility in terms of reviving some of the genres of ancient plays. We don't have to just think of Sanskrit theatre in terms of entirely in terms of love stories or entirely in terms of war. Now, this is one aspect of it, of reviving ancient genres and making them into modern genres. But I think one of the most important element which can be taken from ancient plays and used today is its multilingual nature. You see, most of us are now used to a term called Sanskrit theatre. Most of us don't know that there was nothing like Sanskrit theatre. That in ancient plays, the text, the spoken text or the dialogue was only about maybe 20-25% or 20% Sanskrit, in some places only 15% Sanskrit. The rest was the local languages of those times, like Shaurseni, like Balika, like Ardha Magadhi, Udicya, Dramil. The earlier version of Tamil is called Dramil, or the language of Kerala, or the language of Andhri. Now these languages are mentioned in the Natyashastra very extensively, and it is prescribed that a single play or every play, and particularly a nataka or an erotic play of 10 acts or 7 acts, must have these various languages, because people from different parts of India should speak the language of their part, of their area. Now, we don't know about this. We today think of theatre in a very different way. For us, theatre today is Bengali theatre or Marathi theatre or Hindi theatre or Tamil theatre. It's a single language theatre. Now, the single language theatre never existed in India till the arrival of the Europeans. In the 19th century, when Europeans came, they started producing Shakespeare and Racine and Marlowe, etc. in Calcutta and Bombay and some metropolitan cities. And that's when theatre got revived in the Indian cities, because urban theatre had been dead in India for almost 700 years, as it was not possible to have a performance of something prohibited by Islam. So there was no urban theatre for almost 600-700 years. So when theatre got revived in modern times, it was a monolingual theatre. And then of course we had Marathi theatre and Bengali theatre and several other Hindi theatre, etc., which came in. But ancient theatre was a multilingual theatre. People enjoyed various languages. Even if they did not understand, they had plenty of other things to watch. And all the music in ancient theatre was never in Sanskrit. All these Dhruva songs were in Ardha Magadhi. Very often, because they were sweet and they were very popular, and women always wanted to hear them. So ancient theatre was not just a theatre of different people, it was a theatre of all classes. Now this is in direct contrast to a notion that we carry very often, that ancient Indian theatre was meant for kings or for royalty or for the upper classes only, and the lower classes had nothing to do with it. This is entirely wrong. Ancient Indian theatre had plenty of people who by our modern standards would not qualify to be elite at all. It was a non-elite audience. And it was an audience which came from different parts of India. Of course, the audience would be at a given time at one part of India, but the actors and the performers would be from various parts of India. And when they would perform in different parts of India, then they would see to it that they perform in a manner that the local people like it. Natyashastra, that if you go and perform in Odisha and Bengal, then be very rhetorical, because Bengalis or people in that part of the country like extensive use of language. They like long speeches, they like good literature. So use it for your audience there. If you go to South, then use a lot of dance and music, because people in South, they like that. If you go to North, then please the Jat brothers, have a lot of fighting. So Natyashastra was talking about an all India theatre. And it is again the ancient spirit of Natyashastra that can bring us out of the regionality of our theatre that we are experiencing today. As a consequence of European influence, our theatre, which was an all India theatre, and the only theatre in the world, an all multilingual theatre, a polylingual theatre, has become a monolingual theatre. So I think there is a room now to follow the ancient spirit, to use the ancient techniques, to go into that again and revive and recreate, so that we can have a multilingual theatre in India again today. And we can have it because so many of our traditional forms, they still have inklings of it. Like if you go to see Kudiyattam, you will find some bit of Sanskrit being spoken and some bit of Malayali being spoken. In some other parts, there are other plays, even in Tulu. Of techniques from various parts of India, all kinds of acting and dance and performances techniques are used to make it to a very cohesive and integrate product. Now this was the spirit of Natyashastra, and this spirit was something which kept this theatre alive and also created a huge amount, an immense amount of variety. You see, constant variety and constant change, innovation, was a feature of its theatre. The 10 kinds or the 10 genres that we find, which may have existed, let us say, a couple of 100 years before the Christian era, they ceased to exist, let us say, by 500 AD. And several other new forms evolved. You see, out of the old forms, new forms evolved. Just as we have the evolution of new ragas from old ragas. There's a constantly growing process. Or ragas from Karnataka traveling to north, or from north, going down to south. Similarly, we have this growth. For instance, most of these so-called folk forms, they are indicated as early as 6th or 7th century AD. There used to be a very popular form called Dombika, performed by domes. Domes were a set of actors, and many people think that domes are the original Rome or the Roma who went into Hungary and various parts of Europe. So they have a performance which is described by Abhinavgupta in 11th century. So it was an evolving form from the earlier dance form. And of course, Sangeet Ratnakar, gives us a long description of various kinds of new genres that are constantly evolving. But the substance of this all is that there are certain fundamentals. The fundamentals of Natyashastra were very clearly laid out, and they covered all classes of people, all regions of India, and they were free from any theological restriction. You see, theatre was something which was not Vaishnava theatre or Shaiva theatre. It was not committed to any sampradaya or any theology. It was theatre by itself which included people of all sampradayas. So it was this massive inclusive spirit and a recreative spirit which you find in the text of Natyashastra, and which can be a beacon of new creation in modern times. So thank you very much for giving me a patient hearing, and I'll be happy to take questions if the chair permits. इनकी आवाज नहीं आ रही. Rita ji,
can you unmute? Now you can unmute, please.
Yeah. Rita ji, please.
I think that wanted to ask something. And who is Abhinay Prashant? Will you please ask your questions? Now the panel is open for discussion and questions. Anybody interested asking anything to Bharatji, please.
Okay, here's a question. Let me repeat it for everybody. A very relevant question. Many people ask me, they say, well, music flourished.
Who is Meg Kalyan Tundar?
Meg Kalyan, ये question.
Ma'am, namaste.
Namaskar. Do you have a question?
No, I'm spellbound by the presentation. I just expressed my deep gratitude to Dr.
Always a great pleasure listening to you.
So now let me.
Grand Bharatji, as you.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
There was a question which I was about to answer. A very significant question. The question was, why is it that theatre was muted or not permitted in Islamic rule when dance was permitted, when music was permitted, when painting was permitted, and we have sufficient evidence of all this? Well, only certain kinds of music was permitted in certain areas. You see, then certain kind of paintings were permitted for certain people, and there were certain themes which could be painted. Now, theatre is not an art which can be done privately. Unless it is public, unless it is done in the town square, it has no meaning. That's why what happens in the 11th century is that all theatrical people, they had to leave the cities and they took refuge in various ashramas or in various other sections of either Shaiv or Vaishnav circles. And it is there that they could recreate their whole theatre according to Vaishnav principles, that is, dancing and singing and performing the stories of Krishna or the stories of Rama or the stories of Shiva. You see, singing or dancing about the avatars was always the part of ancient Indian theatre, because ancient Indian theatre is a theatre of avatar. It's like the Greek theatre. It was a theatre again of avatar, that all the mythical characters, they came down on the stage and they enacted their lives. So in India also, theatre was the story of the coming down on the stage of people, of gods, of demons, of human beings, everybody. Now that story could not be told in, let us say, the Delhi of Qutbuddin Aibak or of Alauddin Khalji or even of Akbar. You see, I mean, let us go to history. Let's not go to Mughal-e-Azam where Jodhabhai and Prithviraj Kapoor, they are both, swinging the Bal Gopal. That's all film. It's fine. I enjoy that film greatly. I've seen it 100 times. But the history is different. Theatre was an art which could not be alive unless all sections of population participated. So
I think one of the reasons being also that all the biblical images, the Puranic figures, or Ramayana, or Krishna Leela, very much people are familiar with stories. That's why it is easier to perform and to convince people understand what they are going to watch.
Exactly.
Even then, for
yes.
Ram Leela.
Yes, but look. But there is something else here, and we have completely forgotten about it. And this is something which a lot of our Western friends are very riled about when I ask them this question. You know, I have asked many professors of ancient Greek and modern Greek theatre experts, what happened to Greek theatre? Why did it die out? क्या हो गया भाई उसको गायब क्यों हो गया? Because it was killed. There was a theological reason. They said that a human being cannot become a character, because to create a character is the job of the Almighty. So Yahweh would create you, or Allah would create you, or Patros, the Father, would create you. You cannot create a character. If you create a character, you are like devil. And therefore this act of devilish art has to be prohibited. And therefore St. Augustine and various other theologians, they prohibited theatre. And that is exactly the reason why there cannot be a painting or a three-dimensional representation in Islam either. Now this is a very simple fact. Makarand has a comment.
Maybe also the designs, Islamic designs, cannot represent anything natural.
Yeah, true.
You see, the entire design of Islamic design, you are prohibited to keep photographs even of your patrons.
Right. Yeah, I think Makarand has a comment to make.
In practice, many things happened. There were illustrated manuscripts which were patronized not only by the Persian Islamic rulers but by the Mughals, and these included manuscripts of Hindu texts. We have a scholar working on that. But the other interesting thing what Rita ji said, calligraphy took in very purist environments in Islam, calligraphy, which was beautiful, geometric, ornamental, took the place of representational art. But other than that, I think the story is a little more complex. For example, I think you yourself said, Rita ji, that Ram Leela, Krishna Leela continued. And sometimes they were allowed in certain areas. For example, Vrindavan came up right between Agra and Delhi, in the middle of two power centers, and there's a big story about how that happened. We won't go into that now. But for sure, under Wajid Ali Shah and a whole lot of Muslim Krishna Bhakts, including Ras Khan, I think the cult of Krishna and representational Kathak arts with certain kind of drama were allowed. And one last comment about Greek theatre, very profound point. Actually, ancient Greek theatre was about pagan deities, and so the Christians would not allow it. In fact, there's a wonderful book called The Destruction of the Ancient World, where the writer shows how the Romans and before them the Christianized Greeks, they destroyed the pagan world. And if you go to Greece today also, or even to Rome, most of the ancient temples are reconstructed. So the iconoclasm started long ago. And I think that obviously it was anathema to portray these deities, the pagan deities. But another reason which is implicit in what Bharatji said is that theatre had the potential to be political. So obviously it was banned because if you have a large number of people, you can have subtle messages, you see, put in, which was done later, as we all know, that especially, the progressives and Brecht and others did that. But I think we are indeed very grateful to Rita ji and to the two speakers, Vinod Vidvansji, and to, of course, to my friend Bharat Gupji, who is getting better and better with time. He's really come into his own, and every time he speaks, it's a great delight. Rita ji, I would really request you to end this with a bandish, even a brief one.
No, I'm sorry.
इससे महफिल बन जाएगी. माहौल तो बन चुका है.
महफिल से परे है ये जो हम लोग बात कर रहे हैं. अगली बात कभी होगा. थोड़ा इंस्ट्रूमेंट की जरूरत होती है.
बिल्कुल अवश्य बुलाएंगे. And all your renderings of the various forms have been so dear to our heart. The lectures, the nazms, and all the other forms that you have.
बस दुआओं में मुझे याद रखें. वो दुआओं में याद रखें.
And we should learn humility. We should learn humility from you, Rita ji. Deeply. You prohibit any praise for yourself, which is an amazing thing. So we learned a lot from you. We learned a lot from our two speakers. My deepest gratitude.
Thank you, Vinodji. Thank you, Bharatji. Thank you very much.
Thanks to everybody.
Thank you.
Namaskar.
Can we now segue to the next